and cut my hedges. So I built a cinder block fortress she couldn't tear down. They say when you buy a house, you're not just purchasing walls and a roof, you're buying into a whole new world of neighbors, rules, and sometimes trouble you never asked for. If I had known what was waiting behind the perm hedges and perfect driveways of Sunnyside estates, I might have asked for hazard pay at closing. I never thought I'd become the neighborhood rebel, but sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. My name is Michael, and after 15 years as a structural engineer specializing in residential developments, I thought I understood how to follow rules better than most. Then I moved into Sunnyside Estates, the crown jewel of suburban living, and discovered that sometimes following the rules means fighting the very people who claim to enforce them. When I bought my corner lot 18 months ago, the seller casually mentioned the HOA was particular about appearances, the same way one might describe the Pacific Ocean as a little damp or Mount Everest as somewhat tall. 3 days after moving in, still drowning in a sea of cardboard boxes and trying to figure out which breaker controlled my garage, the doorbell rang. Not just rang, chimed aggressively in a sharp double ding that would soon become the unwelcome soundtrack to my suburban nightmares. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Standing there was Karen Wilkins, president of the Sunnyside Estates HOA, decked out in a crisp white pantsuit and a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her hair was a stiff architectural blonde bob that didn't move even when she tilted her head, probably from enough hairspray to classify her as a minor fire hazard. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give a waiter when they bring the wrong meal. "Hello there," she chirped, her voice smooth but somehow sharp around the edges. "I'm Karen Wilkins, president of the Sunnyside Estates HOA. Just wanted to welcome you personally to our little community." Without waiting for a response, she thrust a 3-ring binder into my hands. The gold-embossed cover gleamed in the sun. 78 pages thick. Mandatory reading, she added, like a judge issuing a life sentence. I suggest highlighting the sections about lawn maintenance and exterior modifications. We've had issues with new homeowners before. The way she said issues made it sound like previous residents had built medieval moats or painted their houses neon green. I thanked her politely, naively thinking this would be the last time I saw her up close. How wrong I was. That evening, between unpacking dishes and questioning my life choices, I flipped through the handbook. It read less like a set of helpful guidelines and more like the constitution of a very petty dictatorship. Rules about acceptable shades of beige for exterior paint. There were 12 approved variations, each with a 4-digit code. Maximum height for garden gnomes? 8 inches. Approved flowers for front yard planting were neatly organized by season, complete with color charts to ensure community harmony. It was less a neighborhood than a heavily curated museum exhibit about suburban control freaks. Still, I decided then and there I would follow every rule meticulously. If Karen wanted conformity, I'd give her conformity so blinding it would make Martha Stewart blush. My lawn was trimmed to exactly 3.5 inches, measured not estimated. My mailbox matched the approved design right down to the required shade of black matte paint. I painted my front door sandstone whisper, the only shade of tan permitted for corner lots with eastern exposure. Trash bins were hidden from street view and only appeared during the approved 12-hour window on collection day. I became the embodiment of HOA perfection. For 6 glorious months, I flew under Karen's radar. I would see her patrol the neighborhood from her luxury SUV, clipboard in hand, dispensing violation notices like a suburban Santa Claus, but she would drive right past my house with barely a glance. I took a perverse pride in my conformity, even as I rolled my eyes at the HOA's monthly newsletter, which listed infractions like unapproved wind chime audible from sidewalk and holiday decorations removed 2 days after grace period. It might have stayed that way forever if not for a simple, perfectly legal improvement I decided to make. My corner lot bordered a busy street, and I wanted a little more privacy, a little less road noise. The handbook, page 42, paragraph 6, stated clearly that natural privacy barriers were allowed, provided they didn't exceed 6 feet in height and didn't impede visibility at corners. So I did my research like a man preparing for battle. I chose emerald green arborvitae, an approved species listed on Appendix C. I had them professionally installed, each one trimmed precisely to 5 feet, 10 inches, well under the limit, and set back 15 feet from the corner, exceeding the required 10-foot setback. Everything was by the book. I even photographed the work from every angle and filed away the documentation just in case. After all, this was Sunnyside Estates, where even the gnomes had regulations. For 3 glorious weeks, my hedges stood tall and proud. They muffled the street noise beautifully. They provided a green, living wall of privacy that made sipping coffee on my front porch feel just a little more peaceful. For a while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, I had beaten the system by playing its own game better than it did. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, I came home to find Karen standing in my yard, flanked by 2 hired workers wielding hedge trimmers like executioners' axes. My beautiful arborvitae had been butchered, hacked down to barely 3 feet tall, nothing more than a sad row of lumpy shrubs. I slammed my car door and stormed across the lawn, my heart pounding with a rage I hadn't felt since my last nightmare construction project with a corrupt city inspector. "Excuse me," I called out, struggling to keep my voice level. "What exactly is going on here?" Karen turned, adjusting her designer sunglasses with one manicured hand. "Michael," she said sweetly, in the tone of a dentist about to announce you need a root canal. "Your hedges were in violation of Code 4.7b. They were obstructing the critical sight line at the corner. As president, I have the authority to remedy violations when a homeowner fails to comply after notification." "Notification?" I demanded. "What notification?" "It was emailed last week to all residents," she said airily, gesturing vaguely toward her clipboard. "The board voted and approved emergency action due to safety concerns." She pointed toward a small orange flag planted at the corner of my property, one I was certain hadn't been there that morning. "This is a designated sightline protection zone. Perhaps you should read the handbook more carefully." I stood there, staring at the wreckage of my $2,000 0-cents investment, feeling a pressure behind my eyes that would have scared a blood pressure cuff. But I kept my voice calm. "Karen, the handbook specifically states that any direct action by the board requires written notice delivered directly to the homeowner with a minimum 5-day compliance window. Email notifications about general issues don't qualify." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment, a crack in the glossy armor. "Well," she sniffed, adjusting her pearls, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but what's done is done. The association will be billing you for the service, $375 0-cents. She handed the workers some cash, thanked them, and marched off down the sidewalk without so much as a backward glance, leaving me alone with my mangled hedges and a rapidly building sense of injustice. That night, surrounded by blueprints and building codes, I pored over the HOA handbook like a man studying for a courtroom battle. Somewhere in those absurdly detailed pages had to be a way to fight back, and as I flipped to Section 7, Paragraph 3, a slow, cold smile crept across my face. There it was. If Karen thought she could play games with the rules, she was about to learn what happened when someone who actually knew how to read the fine print decided to fight fire with precision, engineered fire. If Sunnyside Estates were a sitcom, this was the moment the laugh track would have been replaced by a slow, ominous drumbeat. Karen Wilkins had drawn first blood, and not over crime, not over chaos, but over 2 inches of hedge height. It was almost impressive, in the same way you admire a tornado for its dedication to ruining your day. I wasn't just mad, I was insulted. I had followed every rule, color-coded every guideline, measured every blade of grass like a maniac, and still ended up on the wrong side of Karen's clipboard. It was like losing a rigged spelling bee because you dared to pronounce neighborhood without enough HOA-approved smugness. After watching my $2,000 0-cents worth of arborvitae reduced to a collection of leafy amputees, I wasn't interested in screaming matches or front yard duels. I wanted justice. Cold, precise, by-the-book justice, the kind of revenge you could frame in a flowchart. That night, armed with a highlighter, sticky notes, and the rage of a man wronged by bureaucracy, I cracked open the Sunnyside Estates handbook again. I combed through it like a treasure hunter in a collapsing mine. Lawn watering schedules, acceptable mailbox angles, wind chime decibel thresholds, none of it mattered. I was hunting for a loophole bigger than Karen's ego. And then, buried between regulations on patio furniture color swatches and approved driveway sealant patterns, I found my golden ticket. Section 7.3. It said, clear as day, that any architectural modification properly submitted to the HOA would be deemed automatically approved if not denied within 14 calendar days. No response, no problem. It was right there, written by the same nitpicky overlords who thought 11.5 inches was an unacceptable flagpole height, but 11 inches was fine. The next morning, armed with a plan so diabolical it would make a Bond villain jealous, I filed an official application to replace my hedges with a 6-foot cinder block wall. Not just any wall, a fortress, a bulwark against Karen's nonsense. Designed professionally, rendered beautifully, painted in the officially approved desert tan that matched the community aesthetic better than Karen's coral blouses ever did. He mailed it certified to the HOA office, signature required, and sat back with a grin wider than the Grand Canyon, because Karen might have ruled this neighborhood like a petty queen, but even queens lose when they forget to read the fine print. 2 weeks passed in blissful silence. Not a peep from Karen, not a whisper from the HOA. I called twice, asked politely about my application. Both times, I got the same dismissive answer. The committee is reviewing it, please wait. I waited. I smiled. I marked the calendar days in bright red marker, like a kid counting down to Christmas. On day 15, I rented an excavator. By the time Karen realized what was happening, the trench for the foundation was already dug, the rebar was lined up, and a small crowd of curious neighbors had begun gathering with the same energy people bring to fireworks shows and demolition derbies. Karen's luxury SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house like a soap opera villain arriving to stop a wedding. She came storming across my lawn in her designer heels, flapping her arms like a seagull furious at losing a French fry. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, voice wobbling between indignation and hysteria. I shut off the excavator with the slow, deliberate movements of a man savoring a 5-star meal. Clipboard in hand, hard hat slightly askew for dramatic flair, I climbed down and approached her with the serene smile of someone who had read every rule book, every footnote, and every boring addendum. "Actually, Karen," I said, handing her a neatly stapled packet, "I submitted my application for this wall exactly 15 days ago. According to Bylaw 7.3, my project is automatically approved due to the committee's failure to respond within the 14-day window." She grabbed the papers like they were poisoned, her eyes darting across the text in growing panic. This is preposterous," she sputtered. "I never saw this application." I pulled out a second paper with a little extra flourish, the certified mail receipt bearing her own signature. "Signed for," I said mildly, "by you." Her face cycled through a kaleidoscope of colors, none of them flattering. "I'll be calling an emergency meeting of the board," she snapped. "You're exploiting a loophole." "It's not a loophole, Karen," I replied, adjusting my hard hat with a theatrical sigh. "It's your own procedure. Page 48, paragraph 2, if you need a refresher." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air on dry land. Finally, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her SUV, tires squealing, as she fled down the street in a flurry of righteous indignation and questionable driving decisions. I turned back to my excavator, fired it up again, and got back to work, grinning so wide my cheeks hurt. The neighbors applauded softly from across the street, offering thumbs up and whispered congratulations, like I had just stormed the beaches of HOA tyranny. Because the wall wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was a statement. It was the first shot fired in a rebellion that would shake Sunnyside Estates to its meticulously landscaped core. And Karen had no idea the storm that was about to hit her. Walls usually keep things out. But this one? This wall wasn't just blocking noise or protecting a yard, it was drawing a line in the sand. A bright, bold 6-foot-tall line and Sunnyside Estates was about to find out what side they were really on. Karen, true to form, didn't retreat quietly. 2 days after the foundation was poured and the first rows of cinder blocks laid like bricks of stubborn defiance, I found a notice duct taped to my door with all the subtlety of a ransom note. Violation: improper storage of construction materials in visible areas. Fine: $50.00 per day. Cute. Really, if Karen thought she could nickel and dime me into submission, she clearly hadn't read the chapter in the handbook about active construction projects being granted a 7-day materials exemption. I handled it the way any good engineer would. Clinically and by the book. I rented a storage pod, parked it precisely 17 feet from the curb, 1 foot further than regulations required, and moved every last brick and bag of mortar inside. The next morning, Karen rolled by in her luxury SUV, no doubt licking her chops at the thought of another violation. But when she saw the pod, her face crumpled like a sales receipt pulled out of the dryer. She slowed to a crawl, sunglasses perched on her nose, glaring at the legal, compliant, regulation-approved container that had stolen her petty joy. I stood by my mailbox sipping coffee and gave her a little wave. Victory, after all, is best served with a side of passive-aggressive hospitality. As the wall grew higher, Karen's tactics grew more desperate. She reported me to the county building inspector, claiming I was constructing without a permit. Not just once, 3 times. Each time the inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, expecting chaos, and each time he left, shaking his head and chuckling. Not only had I secured every necessary permit, but my paperwork was so airtight it could have survived a hurricane. "You know," he said during his 3rd and final visit, "this is some of the best residential masonry I've seen in years. Most people cut corners. You could teach a class." I thanked him politely, making sure Karen saw the handshake from her perch behind her living room curtains, where she'd been spying like a discount Bond villain. But the real turning point wasn't my wall, it was the whispers. Neighbors, emboldened by the spectacle, began sharing their own Karen horror stories. Bird feeders ripped down for being unapproved, flowers yanked up because they weren't HOA-sanctioned colors, fines for leaving a trash bin at the curb 17 minutes too long. Each story added a brick to a different kind of wall, a wall of resentment against Karen's rule. It turned out I wasn't just building for myself, I was building a rallying point. Karen, realizing her iron grip was slipping, called an emergency board meeting at the community clubhouse. Naturally, I attended. After all, if you're going to be discussed like the villain of a soap opera, you might as well grab a front row seat. The room was packed. Word had spread. People came with folding chairs and lawn chairs and, judging by the murmur in the room, buckets of long-simmering frustration. Karen stormed in 15 minutes late, sunglasses on indoors, clutching a stack of papers like she was about to unveil a secret weapon. Her voice crackled through the microphone. "The board is moving to retroactively deny approval for the perimeter wall at 118 Willow Court due to safety hazards and violation of community aesthetics," she announced, her tone sharp enough to cut drywall. "Construction must cease immediately, and the homeowner will be fined daily until the structure is removed." She looked directly at me, eyes burning holes in my forehead, as if daring me to protest. I didn't protest. I calmly stood, clipboard in hand, and walked to the microphone. "In accordance with Bylaw 7.3, I said, projecting my voice so even the folks in the cheap seats could hear, "applications unaddressed after 14 calendar days are automatically approved. I have certified mail receipts, dated photographs, and time-stamped communications proving compliance. Further," I added, flipping through my packet like a magician preparing a finale, "perimeter walls are regulated differently than natural barriers and are permitted at 6 feet in height if compliant with county codes, which mine are, as verified by the building inspector." The murmurs swelled into low, approving rumbles. Several people nodded, flipping through copies of the community handbook they had clearly brought after hearing rumors of tonight's showdown. Karen sputtered. This is an abuse of a loophole." "No," said Mrs. Chen, a retired accountant with a voice like a velvet hammer, standing up from the 3rd row. "This is called following the rules, something you seem to believe applies to everyone but you." The room practically vibrated with suppressed laughter. For the first time, Karen's armor cracked. The board members looked at each other, shuffling papers and avoiding her gaze. Even her usual loyalists sat back in their chairs, unwilling to dive onto this particular grenade. The vote to retroactively deny my wall failed spectacularly. Only Karen and her nearest neighbor, who once fined a teenager for sidewalk chalk, voted in favor. Everyone else either abstained or flatly opposed. Karen slammed the gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "Fine," she snapped, "but mark my words, this isn't over." I smiled politely. "Of course not, Karen. It's only just begun." Because while Karen still thought she was fighting a one-man rebellion, what she hadn't realized yet was that the whole neighborhood had quietly started picking sides. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't picking hers. You can win a battle with bricks and bylaws, but if you really want to topple an empire, you need paperwork. Luckily for me, I knew how to swing a clipboard just as well as a hammer. After the wall debacle, Karen was wounded but not defeated. She doubled down on pettiness like a gambler chasing bad bets. New notices appeared taped to my door, accusations of unapproved construction noise, improper sign placement, even overwatering. Each one thinner and more desperate than the last, as if she were throwing darts at the handbook, hoping something would stick. I handled them all the same way, methodically, by the book, and with just enough polite sarcasm to make her eyelid twitch during every HOA meeting. But it wasn't enough to survive Karen's attacks. Not anymore. No. It was time to dig. If she wanted to play games, I was going to play harder. Late one night, fueled by a fresh pot of coffee and a deep, simmering sense of righteous indignation, I started pulling HOA records. By law, financial documents and board meeting minutes were supposed to be available to any homeowner upon request. You could almost hear the records scratch when I emailed the HOA office and got nothing but excuses. Missing files, delayed responses, redirected inquiry. It was like trying to get a straight answer out of a magician halfway through a trick. Undeterred, I began talking to my neighbors. Quiet conversations by mailboxes, casual chats at the grocery store, and what I found was a goldmine of frustration and quiet resentment, unapproved expenses, mysterious landscaping projects billed at triple the normal cost, strange security upgrades that nobody remembered approving. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a walking, talking audit waiting to happen. The tipping point came from Mrs. Chen, the retired accountant who lived 3 doors down. She invited me over for tea, sat me down in her meticulously trimmed garden, and laid it all out like a war map. "You know," she said, pushing a thick folder toward me, "when I was treasurer 2 years ago, the numbers never added up. Karen's brother-in-law owns the landscaping company the HOA uses now. Maintenance costs have doubled since she took over." I flipped through the folder, each page another punch to the gut. Missing invoices, vague consulting fees, landscaping bills that would make the grounds of the White House blush. Mrs. Chen's notes were detailed, methodical, the kind of evidence even Karen's diamond-crusted denial couldn't wave away. It turned out Karen hadn't just bent the rules, she had built her throne out of them, and used the HOA dues of her own neighbors as the bricks. Fueled by a fresh sense of mission, I spent the next 2 weeks assembling a dossier so detailed it could have been entered into evidence at a courtroom trial. Dozens of examples. Procedural violations, unauthorized expenditures, selective enforcement of rules, shady vendor contracts, every accusation backed by scanned documents, dated emails, and, thanks to Mrs. Chen's help, 3 financial audits Karen had conveniently misfiled. And the cherry on top? That beautiful decorative fountain Karen had crowed about during every HOA newsletter? No permits, no inspections, no authorization for $30,000, 0 cents of community funds. A few phone calls to the county later, and a stop work order was issued faster than Karen could reapply her lipstick. The fountain project was shut down mid-construction, a half-finished concrete disaster sitting at the neighborhood entrance like a monument to arrogance. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once cowered under Karen's rule now whispered openly. Sidewalk huddles formed, text chains lit up. Even the folks who kept to themselves, folks who thought HOA politics were as boring as watching grass grow, were suddenly very interested in next month's annual meeting. Karen, oblivious or maybe just desperate, tried to regain control the only way she knew how. More fines, more threats, more passive-aggressive newsletter articles titled things like Community Standards, Why They Matter. It was too late. The tide had shifted. People weren't afraid anymore. And the funny thing about fear, once it's gone, it doesn't come back just because someone in a pantsuit waves a clipboard. As the days ticked closer to the HOA election meeting, I printed out my findings. 15 pages of cold, undeniable facts. An appendix of attachments including certified letters and permit violations. Each packet sealed neatly into an envelope. One for every household. Because if Karen thought she could govern by fear forever, she had forgotten the first rule of any good structure. Build it right or watch it collapse. And Karen's foundation was about to crumble hard. The moments you don't land. You just prepare the battlefield and let the truth swing the sword. That was the spirit I carried into the annual Sunnyside Estates HOA meeting, not with anger, not even with pride. Just the quiet, heavy certainty that when a house is built on sand, it only takes one hard rain to bring it down. I arrived early at the community center, carrying 3 tidy boxes stacked with neatly sealed envelopes, one for every homeowner. No drama, no speeches, just 15 pages of facts, attachments, and signatures. Each envelope bore a simple title on the cover, "Is this the leadership you want for Sunnyside Estates?" By the time Karen swept into the building 15 minutes late and clattering in her heels like a cavalry charge no one had summoned, the room was already buzzing. Normally these meetings struggled to draw a dozen bored retirees. Tonight, almost 100 residents packed the chairs, aisles, and back walls, all thumbing through my report with faces ranging from horrified to furious. Karen froze just inside the doorway when she saw them, seesawing between confusion and outrage like a malfunctioning animatronic doll. She plastered on her best Stepford wife smile and marched to the podium, gavel in hand, trying to pretend the muttering wasn't real, that this was just another meeting she could bulldoze with charm and threats. It wasn't. She barely made it through the approval of previous meeting minutes when Mrs. Chen rose from her seat, voice calm but cutting like a scalpel. "Before we proceed with regular business," she said, holding up her envelope for the entire room to see, "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Wilkins, based on the documented violations of HOA bylaws, potential financial improprieties, and abuse of power detailed in the report we've all received." The second came instantly. First one voice, then another, then a chorus. It sounded less like a formal motion and more like the start of a revolution. Karen's face drained of color so fast it was like someone had yanked the power cord out of her body. She gripped the edges of the podium until her knuckles turned bone white. This is completely out of order," she stammered, her voice rising to a shriek. "We have an agenda. This report is nothing but lies, distortions, personal attacks from a disgruntled homeowner who refuses to follow standards." She might as well have been shouting into the wind. Mrs. Chin adjusted her glasses with the calm authority of a woman who had balanced million-dollar budgets and wasn't impressed by tantrums. "Actually," she said, "the bylaws clearly state that a motion of no confidence takes precedence over all other business if seconded by at least 10% of members present. I believe we've easily met that threshold." The interim secretary, a kind-faced retiree who had endured more than one of Karen's lectures about acceptable mailbox fonts, stood up and counted hands. 97 homeowners present, 88 seconds, well past the 10% required. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land. She turned to the board, searching for backup, but the board members, most of whom had spent the last 2 years nodding along out of fear or exhaustion, stared at their shoes like teenagers caught cheating on a test. The vote wasn't close. Of the 97 homeowners present, 92 voted in favor of removing Karen as president, 3 abstained. Only 2, Karen herself and her neighbor/loyalist/mini Karen, voted against. The gavel Karen still clutched slipped from her hand and clattered loudly against the podium, echoing through the silent room like the last pebble tumbling down a broken dam. You can't do this," she whispered, but her microphone had already been cut off. The vice president's David Thompson, a retired high school principal with a backbone of steel, stepped forward. "In accordance with our bylaws," he said into the microphone, his voice calm and steady, "I will assume the role of interim president until a special election can be held." He paused, letting the words settle, letting Karen hear it, letting her feel it. "My first action," he continued, "is to form an audit committee to review our financial records for the past 3 years. I will also be suspending all pending violation notices until they can be individually reviewed for compliance with HOA procedures." Another ripple of quiet approval moved through the crowd. Karen stood frozen behind the podium, still clutching her printed agenda, still wearing the same stunned expression she had when she walked in and saw the sea of envelopes. David turned to her. "Mrs. Wilkins," he said formally, "please surrender all HOA records and your office keys to the interim board immediately." For a second I thought she might fight, throw a scene, stage a protest, burst into tears. But in the end, there was nothing left. No applause, no jeering, just the quiet, final shuffling of papers, and the beginning of something that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. Freedom. I gathered my things and slipped out the side door into the crisp evening air. No speeches. No gloating. My work was done. I hadn't joined this fight to be a hero. I just wanted to live peacefully, build my wall, maybe plant some flowering vines come spring. But as I paused on the sidewalk, I allowed myself one small smile. Because sometimes all it takes to bring down a tyrant isn't a sword or a mob or a firebrand speech. Sometimes it's just a clipboard and the quiet, stubborn refusal to be bullied one more day. You would think, after a public dethroning that would haunt HOA meetings for decades, Karen would retreat quietly into the suburban shadows, maybe sell her house, maybe join a yoga retreat for disillusioned HOA presidents. But no, Karen Wilkins wasn't the type to go gently. She still believed, somehow, that with enough outrage and denial, she could claw her way back to power. The very next morning, taped crookedly to my front door, was a notice citing me for unauthorized signage, the plaque the neighbors had anonymously left me the night before, reading Defender of Sunnyside Estates. It was small, tasteful, and entirely within size regulations. But Karen wasn't concerned with rules anymore. She was grasping at the last scraps of her authority like a drowning woman reaching for driftwood that had already caught fire. I didn't even bother taking the notice down. I left it hanging there, a sad little flag of her defeat. Walking back inside, I spotted her out of the corner of my eye, storming down the sidewalk, phone clutched to her ear, no doubt demanding some poor city clerk do something about the injustice of being held accountable. She didn't realize the walls were already closing in. That afternoon, Mrs. Chen and David Thompson made it official. The preliminary audit had uncovered far more than creative landscaping contracts. It uncovered outright theft. $20,000 funneled into a consulting account linked directly to Karen's personal bank. Before the moment the news spread, it was like someone flipped a switch. The same neighbors who had once smiled politely at Karen now avoided her like she was radioactive. Vendors started canceling contracts. Local law enforcement took an interest. The only thing spreading faster than Karen's excuses was the paperwork being filed against her. I stayed out of the chaos, let it all happen without my fingerprints. After all, I wasn't the villain or the hero of this story. I was just the guy who built a wall and let the truth do the rest. But Karen, being Karen, couldn't resist one last gasp. 2 days after the audit news broke, as I was trimming the new desert plants along my wall, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. I turned just in time to see her, red-faced, hair disheveled for the first time since I'd known her, jabbing a finger an inch from my chest. "Yow!" she hissed, trembling with rage. "You engineered this. You planned this from the beginning, just to humiliate me." I sighed, setting down the trimmers, suddenly feeling more tired than triumphant. "No, Karen," I said calmly. "You engineered this yourself. I just followed the rules. Your rules. Every single one of them. I pointed gently toward the wall, the fully permitted, regulation-compliant, HOA-approved wall that now stood as a monument to malicious compliance. Her face twisted in fury, veins standing out along her temples. She shook her head like a child denied a toy at Christmas. "This isn't over," she spat. "Nobody makes a fool of me and gets away with it." Before I could respond, a new voice cut through the thick afternoon heat. "I think it is over, Karen." We both turned. Mrs. Chen stood at the curb, arms folded, flanked by David Thompson and another board member. Their faces were calm, almost pitying. David held up a thick manila folder. "We just finished reviewing the financial records you left behind. Would you care to explain why $20,000 of HOA funds were transferred to your personal account last month?" And Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out, a goldfish caught in the air, realizing the bowl was gone. "And while you're at it," Mrs. Chen added sweetly, "maybe you can explain why your brother-in-law's landscaping company billed us double the market rate for the last 3 years. Karen's face cycled through rage, fear, denial, all in the space of a heartbeat. But for once there was no crowd to bully, no board to manipulate, no rule book to twist. There was only silence. Heavy, undeniable silence. And in that silence, Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed queen of Sunnyside Estates, finally learned what real accountability looked like. She turned without another word, stumbling slightly as she fled up the sidewalk, disappearing behind her house like a villain in the last scene of a play that closed badly on opening night. I watched her go, feeling no glee, no spite, just a long, deep, quiet relief. Sometimes, the biggest victories don't end with cheering or fist-pumping celebrations. Sometimes they end with a slow, satisfied breath, the soft creak of a porch chair, and the knowledge that you don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. That night I sat outside under the stars, coffee mug in hand, watching the warm lights of my neighborhood, my real neighborhood, glow against the dark. Kids' bikes leaned against fences, dogs barked in the distance. Somewhere, laughter floated on the breeze. No more inspections at dawn, no more clipped passive-aggressive newsletters, no more Karen. Yes, these. And if I glanced occasionally at my sturdy cinder block wall, now wrapped with flowering vines and solar lights that twinkled like small stars, I did so with the quiet pride of a man who hadn't just defended his property. He had defended his freedom. One brick, one rule, one stubborn, unbreakable page at a time. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.